It is my great honor to have Professor S.Mavroudeas with us today. He's going to discuss the Greek economic crisis of 2010. But before we do that, please let me introduce him very briefly. Professor Stavros is a professor of political economy in the Department of Social Policy at Pantheon University, Greece. And he has received his bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Athens. His master's degree is in the economics of public policy in developed and developing countries. And it comes from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. His PhD is in economics from Birkbeck College, also part of the University of London. His research interests include political economy, history of economic thought, growth theory and development economics, the political economy of European integration, and the Greek economy. He has written several books in English and in Greek. Some of them are The Limits of Regulation, published in 2012, the Greek Capitalism in Crisis, a Marxist Analysis, published in 2014, and Political Economy and Its Critique, published in 2006. He also has published many chapters in collective volumes. Some of these chapters and work have been published and translated into other languages, including Chinese. And in addition, Professor S.Mavroudeas has published many articles in many international academic journals. He has also been a visiting researcher and professor at several universities, including the School of Oriental and African Studies, City University, Kingston University of London, the University of Siena, etc. In 2018, Professor S.Mavroudeas received the Distinguished Achievement Award on World Political Economy of the 21st Century for his book, Greek Capitalism in Crisis, a Marxist Perspective, published by Routledge. So without any further ado, please let's welcome Professor S.Mavroudeas. Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. It's been a pleasure giving this talk, and I'll proceed directly since time is pressing, and I'll share with you the presentation of this. I need to have the rights. Okay, let me.
Just hold on a second.
Yep.
Yes, I can put the presentation on the screen. Give me just 1 second.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, you can also.
I have the rights, so I can do it.
Okay, you can do it. Then go ahead, because you have now access to sharing the screen. Okay, perfect.
Okay. Hang on a minute. Okay. As you know, the subject of my talk is the Greek crisis, the Greek saga, because it's an ongoing crisis. And what I'll try to do is to analyze the different explanations competing between them regarding the causes of this crisis. When I refer to Greek crisis, I mean the 2010 Greek crisis. There were others before and others afterwards, as we shall see. But the center of attention is the 2010 crisis, the one that nearly brought Greece out of the footsteps of a Grexit, of an exit from the European Monetary Union and possibly the European Union. The last part would be a comparison of the situation before during the crisis and nowadays. It will be very brief because of time constraints, but if needed during the QA time, I can expand on this. So to proceed directly, you can you can read the PDF. So I'll cover, I'll pass over several pages. Now, I categorize the groups of explanation of the Greek 2010 crisis in three main streams. They come, of course, and logically, from different theoretical traditions. So the three mainstreams are mainstream approaches, heterodox approaches and Marxist approaches. Some clarifications regarding this categorization. In mainstream approaches, I enclose both neoliberal and new Keynesian approaches. That is, approaches that follow the so-called new macroeconomic consensus, which is essentially is a new Keynesian perspective. It has common elements with neoliberalism, but it has also significant differences. And to add a final point on this, in my opinion, the currently dominant economic paradigm is not neoliberalism, is new Keynesianism and his new macroeconomic consensus. It is not better than neoliberalism. It's one of the same, but with differences regarding both the analytical toolbox and also the policy, the theory about economic policy and policy prescriptions. So within mainstream, I include both neoliberal views and new Keynesian views. Within the heterodoxy, I include mainly the so-called heterodox political economy or radical political economy, that is post-Keynesian and traditional Keynesian perspectives, and also Marxo-Keynesian or Keynesian Marxist views. That is hybrid views. And then within the Marxist tradition, I include the more traditional then, but more clear-cut Marxist perspective. And I'll explain the analytical differences immediately afterwards. So three mainstreams regarding the explanations of the Greek crisis. Now, each one is further subdivided. So I discern within the mainstream explanations three subcategories. The first, that the Greek crisis is a specifically Greek crisis concerning only Greece. That is, it is a Greek disease. The second view that the Greek crisis is part of the European Monetary Union crisis and comes from the fact that the monetary union, the Eurozone, is not an optimal currency area. That means this OCA means optimal currency area. And this failure cannot be rectified. And the third view argues that, okay, the Greek crisis is part of the Eurozone crisis. It stems from the fact that the Eurozone is not an optimal currency area, but this can be rectified under certain conditions and policy measures. Now, the heterodox explanations are mainly four. The first is an explanation attributing the Greek crisis to a combination of underconsumption and financialization. The second is a view that argues that the Greek crisis is caused by some process of Minsky disinflation. And the third argues that the Greek crisis erupted because of a combination of class struggle and financialization. And the last one is again on a financializationist explanation, arguing that the Greek crisis is a financialization crisis. Now, the Marxist explanations are subdivided in three categories, three views. First, that the Greek crisis is caused by the falling rate of profit, that is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, that is TRPF. A second one that agrees with the first, but argues that this tendency of the rate of profit to fall is combined and aggravated by the fact that the Greek capitalism is subject to economic imperialist exploitation by more developed capitalist economies. And the third one argues that the Greek crisis is a combination of falling profitability, but also underconsumptionism. Now I'll skip this over. Let me try to explain this table. In this table, I'm trying to summarize the main characteristics of the three general perspectives, the three general approaches that I delineated before. We have the mainstream explanations, the heterodox explanations, and the Marxist explanations. In the first column, I describe what is the view regarding the 2008 global crisis that preceded the 2010 Greek and EMU crisis. The second column refers to the causes of the crisis, the third to the analytical focus, the fourth, whether they consider the profit rate as an important determinant in the Greek crisis or not. The next, whether they consider the optimal currency areas problem as important or not. And the third is TDH, is the twin deficits hypothesis. This is the mainstream, as we shall see below, is the mainstream explanation of the Greek crisis. The twin deficits hypothesis is actually a new Keynesian hypothesis proposed by Paul Krugman. It argues that you have two deficits, a fiscal deficit and a current account deficit. And also it proposes a causality, that is, the fiscal deficit caused the current account deficit. Now, the mainstream views consider the Greek crisis of 2010 as completely independent from the global 2008 crisis that preceded, and that the Greek economy was affected by the global crisis only externally. The heterodox views give mixed answers. Others concur with the mainstream response. Other explanations say that the 2008 global crisis had an effect on the Greek crisis. The Marxist explanations argue that the 2008 global crisis and the 2010 peripheral Europe EMU crisis are connected. That is, the 2010 crisis is a continuation of the 2008 global crisis, a continuation with local characteristics. Regarding the causes of the crisis, the mainstream views attributed to policy errors, and also to some Greek structural problems. For example, they argue that, okay, South Europeans are lazy, not productive, and so on. This is considered a structural problem, but it is a local problem. It's not a problem, for example, of the socioeconomic system, of the capitalist system. It's just a local specificity, a national specificity. Now, the heterodox explanations recognize as causes of crisis what I term weak structural problems. And these are, for example, neoliberal policies and sometimes the structure of the European Monetary Union, the structure of the Eurozone. In contrast to all the previous Marxist explanations attempt to recognize the causes of the crisis in the deep structure of the system. That is, in deep contradictions within the DNA of the capitalist mode of production in general, and how these deep generic contradictions are then modified and probably exacerbated in the national economic formations and the national social formations of Greece and other peripheral EMU economies. So they put the blame, to put it bluntly, first at the fundamental contradictions of the capitalist system, and then on how these contradictions are modified and probably exacerbated in the social formations of the South European economies, particularly those that belong to, all of them actually belong to the European Monetary Union. Now, the analytical focus of the mainstream views is on exchange relations. The analytical focus on the heterodox views is on monetary relations, and particularly the European Monetary Union mechanism. The Marxist explanations begin their analysis by focusing on the productive structure, the structure of the economy. For this reason, as we shall see afterwards, the Marxist explanations were the first to point out that the productive structure, the so-called productive model of the Greek economy, is a faulty one. So all the problems begin from this and not simply from the participation in the monetary union or some problem of competitiveness. Now, regarding the profit rate, the mainstream views do not consider it. The heterodox views share the same view. They do not pay attention to the profitability. The Marxist views, of course, pay attention. For Marxist economic analysis, profitability is the main determining factor of the modus operandi of the capitalist mode of production. Regarding the optimal currency area problem, the mainstreamers, of course, focus on this. The same holds about the heterodox views. The Marxist explanations consider it, but put it within a more general and more realistic, in my opinion, framework. That is, they argue that the problem of the optimality or not of the currency area derives from the disproportionality, the uneven and combined development of capitalist economies, and particularly how this uneven and combined development takes place within the European Union. And lastly, regarding the twin deficit hypothesis, the mainstreamers focus on this. It's the main explanatory framework regarding the Greek crisis. They argue that the fiscal deficit caused the current account deficit, and then the crisis exploded. The heterodox views reverse the causality. They share the same view that the Greek problem is simply a problem of twin deficits, but the causality runs differently. That is, it is the current account deficit that caused the fiscal deficit, the current account through the trade deficit, particularly. And then the Marxist explanations discard this egg of Columbus dilemma by saying that the twin deficits are the results and not the causes of the problem. The causes should be found elsewhere. Now this table tries to summarize whether each type of explanation emphasizes not conjectural, conjunctural is this with U and C, that is time-specific causes or structural causes. The mainstream explanations are simply conjunctural explanations, emphasis on policy errors, national or supranational, whereas the heterodoxy and the Marxist explanations are more structural. They put emphasis on the structure of the economy, but they have differences. The heterodoxy has a weak structural emphasis on midterm features like neoliberalism and the monetary union, European monetary union, whereas the Marxist explanations give a strong structural explanation, emphasis on by placing emphasis on long-term systemic features. Now, I'll skip this because I said it before. It summarizes the arguments of the three main views. These are the bibliographical references of the three mainstream approaches. In the PDF I have shared, you can find the appropriate references. I skip this. These are the same for the radical explanations, and this is the same for the Marxist explanations. Now, let me move to the mainstream explanation. I categorize them, I divide them in two versions. Let me recapitulate. Here I focus on the first mainstream approach, that is the one that argues that the Greek 2010 crisis was a specific Greek crisis, a Greek disease. Keep in mind that the Greek crisis erupted before the rest of the peripheral EMU economies crisis. So for a small period, it was the only crisis during 2010. This first mainstream version reigned during that period. It said no other crisis will erupt, only the Greek, and the Greek is because the Greek economy is a problematic economy. So it is a Greek disease. It was expressed by the EU and the European Union and the European Central Bank, by many think tanks of the Eurocore countries and so on, and also by the Greek politico-economic establishment. Now, it took two versions. The first version, which corresponds to the first economic adjustment program for Greece. EAP is economic adjustment program for Greece. We have three economic adjustment programs for Greece. These are the austerity programs imposed by the European Union and the IMF, but also agreed by the Greek bourgeoisie. And there are essentially austerity policies with structural reforms. So the first EAP focused on the public sector and the fiscal deficit. it soon was derailed. It failed utterly regarding its provisions and its milestones, and also its expectations regarding particularly the growth rate. So it was soon replaced by a second version, which added that not only the Greek public sector is ill, but also the Greek private sector is ill. So it added the problem of falling competitiveness. So whereas the first version extended austerity only to the public sector, the second version extended austerity measures to the private sector as well. I'll skip the rest because of time limits. And let me move to the analytical scheme of this views. Now, the simple version argued that in Greece there is a big public sector because of clientelism. That is because governments employ more public employees than what should be required in order to get votes. They also pay high wages in the public sector. These wages are high because not only because there are too many public employees, but also because they have low productivity. And this is also supplemented by a reduced tax collecting ability of the state, again because of clientelism. This all caused an increased fiscal deficit, that is expenses to go ahead to drive ahead of incomes, public incomes, and in order to finance this fiscal deficit, the Greek state has to resort to debt, to external borrowing, to borrowing, and this borrowing took the form of external borrowing outside the country through international financial markets because of the low interest rates for euro economies at that period. Now, at some point in time, that is after the 2008 crisis, financial markets became jittery, and they started to question the debts that have been created. Then suddenly it was found that the Greek debt is not sustainable for a number of realistic or unrealistic reasons. There's a big debate on this, and then this created brought to the forward the current account deficit of the Greek economy, and caused the essential bankruptcy of the Greek state. Now, the augmented version of this argument, that is the second version, is the following. It argued that there were exorbitant wage increases in Greece. These were encapsulated in the unit labor costs, the nominal unit labor costs. These exorbitant nominal ULCs increased both the fiscal deficit of the public sector, but also created an uncompetitive private debt sector, and this increased trade deficits. As a combined result, there was an increase in the current account deficit. So the combined version, the augmented version, is bit more sophisticated than the simple one. Now, in analytical terms, the Greek disease explanation hints upon the Keynesian twin deficit hypothesis. That is, that fiscal deficits cause the current account deficit. Now, there are empirical studies of this, and they are rather inconclusive. There is an older one study for the Greek economy, Vamvoukas 1997. It confirms the twin deficit hypothesis, but there are several other studies afterwards which give very ambiguous results. That is, they confirm for some period this causality, but they reject it for another. So in empirical terms, even from within mainstream view, coming from mainstream views, the twin deficit hypothesis is far from being a universally accepted and obvious explanation of causality. Now, the second view, that is that the Greek crisis is a part of the European Monetary Union crisis and comes from the fact that the EMU is not an OCA and not an optimal currency area, was expressed mainly by Anglo-Saxon commentators, either neoclassical or new Keynesian. Their main argument was, okay, Greece has its own problems, but these are being exacerbated by the non-optimality of the EMU, and this cannot be corrected, this non-optimality. The reasons for this are twofold. First, geopolitical, that there's the competition between the European Union and the US regarding particularly monetary supremacy, and thus the role of the euro. And of course, it was an academic cause, that is the thing of optimal currency areas. Now, the view that the Greek crisis has wider aspects, that is the problems of the European Monetary Union, was expressed but these problems these flaws can be rectified, were expressed mainly by European analysts, predominantly New Keynesian and post-Keynesian, which argue that, okay, the European Monetary Union is a problematic union, but under certain conditions, either a bigger federalism, a fiscal union, for example, and even a banking union, or with the withdrawal of neoliberal policies, that is, deregulationist policies, then the European Monetary Union can become a quasi, at least, optimal currency area, and then the problems would be solved. Now, I'll skip all this. The mainstream explanations in the more evolved version discern two sets of causes for the Greek crisis: internal causes and external causes. The analytical bone is the twin deficit hypothesis. Now, there are serious empirical problems regarding this argument. It argues, the twin deficit hypothesis, is ultimately that wages are the factor that triggered the fiscal deficit, but also the current account deficit. In order to support this argument, those that ascribe to it refer only to the nominal unit labor costs. That is, they make relative comparisons with other economies and their labor costs. This is utterly problematic. Why? Because we know very well that apart from the nominal unit labor costs, we have also the real unit labor costs. And these are a much better measure of whether wages are exorbitant, wage increases are exorbitant or not. The real unit labor costs are actually the wage share. Now, what we can see from the table below is that the real unit labor costs for Greece have been constantly decreasing from the 1960 till the beginning of the crisis. And of course, they fell much more after the austerity policies during the crisis. So there are no exorbitant wage increases in Greece. The productivity increases, the wage increases lagged constantly behind the productivity increases. The second argument is the so-called Caldor paradox. That is, that competitiveness does not depend only on cost for competitiveness, but also on structural competitiveness. That is, on qualitative factors. Nicholas Caldor has shown in a very convincing theoretical but primarily empirical study that those economies that are more competitive are not low-wage economies, but high-wage economies. And the competitiveness derives from structural, not cost factors. The third is that the supposed solution to the problem of the twin deficits hypothesis, that is to lower wages, it's a no-go in the sense that you have to lower your wages compared to the wages of others, but others can do the same. So you can actually enter a race to the bottom where the bottom is nowhere near, and no solution, of course. And I'll skip this because I'm already behind schedule. Now, the mainstream views have also wider problems. They totally underestimate the role of the global crisis, or the 2008 global crisis, and they consider the Greek crisis as independent from this. This is totally wrong. They also fail to appreciate the fundamental structural dimensions of the Greek crisis, and particularly the problem of the productive model of the Greek economy. The Greek economy has become a more or less service economy since its accession to the European Common Market. Before its accession to the European Monetary Union, this has led to a deindustrialization process and has created a very problematic economy with weak internal linkages and a low ability to generate surpluses. Now let me move to the radical approaches. These emphasize the crisis-prone nature of capitalism. They are critical of neoliberalism, and particularly of the so-called neoliberal architecture of the European Monetary Union. but they are also shy of recognizing systemic deficiencies of the capitalist system. The emphasis of the radical explanations are to propose some form of reformed European capitalism. The central block of most of these radical explanations is financialization, a very popular nowadays view. My general opinion is that the financialization theory in all its versions is an extremely problematic theory, particularly in its more coherent versions, the ones that argue that the financial system has broken loose from the productive system, that is, the bankers and the financiers have become independent of the productive capitalists, and that the profits, the financial profits, do not come from surplus value and redistribution from the profits of the industrialists, but come through usury, that is, through usurious exploitation of not only the working class, but also other sections of the capitalist class. I consider this as a totally problematic theory. I've written about this. I won't expand more on this unless needed in the QAs. So I skip this argument and I move directly to the financializationist explanations of the Greek crisis. There are three of them. The one is trying to implement the Minskian perspective, coming from the financial instability hypothesis in the Greek cases. The second argues that there is put financialization in the context of the European Monetary Union, that is the North-South divide. Kostas Lapavitsas is an exemplary case in this. And then there is a third view, financialization in the national context, Milios and Sotiropoulos, whereas the North and South divide for this view does not exist. Now, in my opinion, the empirical aspect of all these views regarding financialization in the Greek economy is utterly wrong, totally unrealistic. First problem, the Greek economy has a very relatively low household debt. Household debt is an important factor in the financialization analysis. Now, as we can see from this table, household debt is a new phenomenon in Greece from 2000 and onwards. It existed before, but was even lower. It is lower than in most Western economies. It surpassed at some point before the eruption of the crisis only Spain, and it is well below other economies, other Western economies. So households' debt cannot be posed as a cause of the 2000 Greek crisis. The second problem is that the Greek economy is a bank-based economy, whereas the financialization argument stresses the role of the stock exchange, not the banking sector. Also, the Greek banking sector, and in general, the Greek economy is a low financial leverage economy, contrary again to the financializationist argument. I won't expand on the table. You can see the differences. There are marked differences regarding the Greek economy. The Greek economy cannot be characterized as a financialization, financializationist the economy. So the Greek 2010 crisis cannot be characterized as a financializationist crisis. I'll skip the specifics of these arguments because of the time constraint. And I'll move directly to the Marxist explanations. The Marxist explanations, as I have already said, focus on deep structural contradictions of the capitalist economy, and particularly on the notorious tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Through empirical studies, there are, I've put in the last part of the PDF, of this PDF, the results of the study of a study that I have made with Dimitris Paitaridis. Similar are the results of the study by Thanasis Maniatis and Kostas Passas. There are similarities, but there is a different methodology with the study by Economakis, Markaki, and Androulakis. The difference of the two first versions with the third lays in the fact that the two first versions follow the Sagan-Tonak methodology of measuring the rate of profit, and distinguish between productive and unproductive labor, whereas the third study, Economakis, Markaki, and Androulakis, do not make this distinction between productive and unproductive labor, and also measure the rate of profit, the organic composition of capital, and so on, through via aggregate national accounts data without further elaboration on this, so as to make them more close to the Marxian categories. Now, the difference between the first two views that have the same methodology and fairly the same results is that the second, that is the one conducted by me and Dimitris Paitaridis, added the agricultural sector as part of the capitalist sector of the Greek economy for a number of reasons, and also added that there are imperialist economic exploitation processes that signify a transfer of value from the Greek economy to more developed more imperialist Greek economy, Western European economies. Now, I see the time is running fastly, so I'll skip all this. The particular explanation, and I'll move directly to the last part, that is the current condition of the Greek economy. When the Greek crisis erupted, the dominant circles in the European Union, in the West in general, and in Greece, that is the IMF, the European Union, and the Greek governments, went forward with the economic adjustment program strategy, which promised that after the implementation of these adjustment programs, the Greek crisis would be solved and the Greek economy would become a healthy economy, a prudent economy. Now, today we are 13 years after this strategy began being implemented, so we can have a very fair and realistic comparison view of what actually it had succeeded. And in fact, it hadn't succeeded at all. The only thing that it succeeded is to just kick the can forward, that is, move the problem ahead without solving it. The Greek economy 13 years afterwards is characterized by successive crises and recessions and weak rebounds regarding the losses. After the 2000 crisis, we had the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Greek economy lost, because of the 2010 crisis and the adjustment programs, 25% of its GDP. And then it lost again another 10% during the COVID-19 crisis. What it chipped back before the COVID crisis and nowadays, it's just peanuts. I mean, with the so-called productive gap, that is the need of productive investment that is required in order for the Greek economy to recover to the pre-crisis, pre-2010 crisis levels, remains huge. And of course, this investment is nowhere to be found. These problems, so there is a failure to rectify the crisis. That was the first assertion that the EAPs did. They promised a quick recovery to the pre-crisis levels. And they failed. The second problem is that after the pandemic, there is an inflation surge in Greece, and this complicates a lot matters. The third problem is that the productive model of the Greek economy remains the same as it was before the crisis. The Greek productive model has been constructed on the basis of the accession to the European Common Market. That is, the production structure of the Greek economy follows the division of labor of the European integration. Within this division of labor, the role for a small peripheral economy like that of Greece is only to focus mainly on services, and particularly tourism, some low-level industrial sectors, and the rest is also a weak agricultural sector. This is a very weak productive structure. The mainstream views, but even the radical views, do not consider it, at least to a great extent, as a significant problem. Whatever changes they try to do, the dominant circles, through overt or covert industrial strategy, is simply, these changes are simply a continuation of the same motive, that is, the same productive model. And this has been proved as problematic. The last point is that the cause of the twin deficits that the EAPs were supposed to throw away, there are actually, these twin deficits are actually returning in the Greek economy. I'm finishing in just a few moments. Here we can see the evolution of the Greek GDP in constant 2015 terms. We can see the huge fall in the beginning of the crisis, and then we can see that whatever recovery took place was almost peanuts, without significance. I'll skip this, the effects of the post-COVID inflation surge. Here is the evolution of inflation. There is an issue here regarding whether this surge of inflation had the profit inflation component. I'm skipping this. Now, here we can see the debt to GDP ratio, and this actually increased for the Greek economy since the beginning of the crisis, instead of decreasing. Here we can see another view of its evolution. There is a fall this year, but this fall is mainly because of the inflation. That is, because the ratio of debt to GDP, the GDP measure is in nominal terms, in current prices, and because inflation tends to inflate this measure. For this reason, we have a drop in the debt to GDP ratio. But overall, we can see that this ratio has not been rectified since the beginning of the crisis in 2010. And then here is the current account balance, where we can see that there is, again, during particularly the last year, 2 years, a significant deterioration, that is an increase of the current account deficit. I'm finishing here because I think I've already exhausted my time slot.
Yes, you have 1 minute left.
Oh, okay. Okay, let us use it for the QA there if needed.
Okay, very good then. So do we have a question for Professor Mavroudeas? If you want, you can leave your question in the chat, or you can send it to me and I can read it on your behalf. Well, I have a question about the business cycle. So the student is saying that we have been studying the business cycle before in class, but this seems a little bit more serious than just a business cycle. So what is the difference between a business cycle and the Greek crisis?
All right. Okay. A business cycle is the short-term economic cycle, the short-term economic cyclical fluctuation, that is 3 to 5 years. Right. It's a business cycle is a more or less normal fluctuation between an upswing and a downswing. So you have an increase of the GDP and also an increase, but both these fluctuations are mild. When we are talking about a crisis, then we have a deep fall in the GDP. This goes beyond the limits of the business cycle. So a crisis is a disruption of the normal process of business cycles. It's a very big downswing that goes beyond the normal fluctuations of a capitalist economy. The Greek crisis of 2010 was a crisis, that is, it was a marked deviation from the normal economic cyclical fluctuations of the Greek economy.
Yes, thank you very much. And it's exactly 11 o'clock. So thank you very much for your thorough and insightful talk. And I'm going to stop the recording now. Let me just stop.